To come in. So fantastic to see so many of you here this morning, so many familiar faces and some new faces, and of course welcome to all of you that are online as well. We have a Zoom option, so we're I don't know how many there are at the moment, but 22. Oh, excuse me, 22. Fantastic. Okay, so that's so welcome to all of you who are there, and we are so pleased that you took the time this Saturday to come out and to be a part of this gathering this morning. My name is Carrie. I'm a Mennonite settler from originally from the Dakota Territory south of the border, but now I reside here as a guest in Treaty 1 in Winnipeg, where I work for a Mennonite Central Committee. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all here to this gathering this morning that is focused on returning wealth, land reparation, and the church. A couple of weeks ago, here in Winnipeg at CMU, some of us heard the theologian William James Jennings powerfully remind us that the idea of return is close to the center of Christian faith and the message of the gospel. And yet, he said, we live inside theft, and it is a troubled dwelling. To think and live against the legacy of theft and to think toward a reality of return and reparation of the land and the body, this is the work that we Christians in the Western world have never really fully embraced, he said. And last evening, also at CMU, Sarah Augustine stated that the logic of settler colonialism is the logic of individualism and extractivism, again, a form of theft from the collective body and the land. And she declared, how will we stop this freight train? Together or not at all, she said. So today we seek to turn our attention towards this legacy of theft and to begin to take some small, tangible steps as non-Indigenous Mennonites and Christians towards return. But even more importantly, to do it in relationship, because as Sarah says, the antidote is knowing that we are not alone. In May of last year, in 2022, the Mennonite Coalition on Indigenous Solidarity, the banner up there, or MCIS, organized a small gathering of Winnipeg congregations, including this one here, where we began some preliminary conversations about reparations to Indigenous nations as congregational bodies. It was an opportunity for those congregations to gather together to discuss with each other ideas, questions, best practices, challenges, and to learn from each other. From that event came a clear call for further learning opportunities that might engage a broader audience. And therefore, the organizers of that event, along with some other good folks, came together to initiate this follow-up conference that brings us here today. We are also aware that today is the day that the Canadian state marks Remembrance Day. Those of us from an Anabaptist tradition tend to hold a commitment to nonviolence, while we also value remembering the many who've given up their lives while courageously following their deepest core convictions for a better world, in whatever form that takes. So we take a moment to remember all those who've given of themselves in this way, as we remember those too whose lives are tragically ended as a result of violent conflict in places like Palestine, Israel, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and the many Indigenous women, men, and children around the world whose lives are also ended by systemic violence, resource extraction, and displacement, including here in Treaty 1. Truly, to remember is to work for peace, which is the work that we commit ourselves to today. I will invite Esther to come do the land acknowledgement, or do you want to do this first?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'd invite, okay. Yeah, why don't you come do the land acknowledgement, and then we'll do some other.
Good morning, everyone. On a day when we consider the Church's role in making reparations to Indigenous peoples, it is especially important to acknowledge the land and the original peoples of this land, the ones who stewarded the land before the arrival of settlers and the imposition of settler colonialism. We are, of course, gathered on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 negotiated in 1871 between the Crown and the Ininiwak Cree, the Anishinaabe, and the Dakota. This is also the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Today, we are about a kilometer west of the Red River. Long before European settlement, First Nations traveled the river to hunt and to trade. They gathered and did ceremony at the forks north of here. The intersection of the La Salle and the Red Rivers just south of here was another important meeting place. The First Nations harvested sturgeon from the river, wild rice from the marshes and small lakes, and sugar from the box elder, or Manitoba maples, that grew along the river's edge. In places, they also grew potatoes, corn, and pumpkin. This area along the Red River was an important place for the Métis before the European settlement began. The Métis occupied long, narrow river lots extending 2 miles from the Red River out to the prairie, and a 2-mile extension beyond that was called the Hay Privilege. The Métis farmed here. They also traveled the Pembina Trail, now Pembina Highway, to participate in the bison hunt further south and west. In 1869, just a few kilometers west of here, a group of Métis stopped a Canadian government survey crew from surveying the Hay Privilege land belonging to Métis leader, farmer, and bison hunter André Nault. That marked the beginning of the Métis-led Red River resistance. As a result of the resistance, in 1870, an act of parliament created the province of Manitoba. The act promised to ensure the land rights of the Métis people. In 1871, a year later, the Crown signed Treaty 1 with First Nations chiefs, promising to share the land respectfully. These promises were not kept. First Nations were soon forced onto tiny reserves, and the Métis, in large measure, never received the land that had been pledged. And in subsequent years, thousands of them left Red River and moved further west. Mennonite settlers arrived in Manitoba in 1874 and benefited from the dispossession and displacement of the First Nations and the Red River Métis. Mennonites and many other people are continuing to benefit from that dispossession and displacement. So we gather here today with the story of this land and its peoples speaking to us. We gather here and we humbly acknowledge the harms done to Indigenous peoples by settler peoples. We gather in hope that Creator will guide us in healing relationships and reconciling ways.
Good morning. I am your logistics person today, Melanie Neufeld with Mennonite Church Manitoba. I co-chair with Carrie Zahner-Harvey on the Mennonite Coalition for Indigenous Solidarity, and I'm grateful to be with you all here in this place on this land, and I'm grateful for the orientation that Carrie offered initially to kind of figure out where we've all been and how we've come to this place together to think about returning wealth. And I want to do a bit of thank yous to start us off, just to know the vast amount of people that have been helping and supporting us for this day to be together in this space. So you were introduced to Esther Eptison. Jeff Friesen is online with us, and he was part of the planning, Carrie Zahner-Harvey, Jonathan Neufeld, and we had an awesome group of Fort Garry Mennonite people show up, and Pat helped to get them organized. So Pat Gerber-Paul's in the back. Thank you so much. We had Also, Dieter is our sound person, also hoping to take care of our Zoom people. We had a lot of late registers yesterday, and I'm sorry, I did not get them in my email, so I didn't know those folks had all signed up. So I'm grateful that we have additional people that have joined. Dale and B. Shantz and Andrew Clausen, thank you all for the volunteering that people have offered. Jonathan and Sarah, Dick, thank you for helping with the setup. All of those things allow us to make this opportunity to come together and be in community. Unfortunately, Stan McKay, our elder, is stuck in the north at Fisher River, so he was not able to join us. But we have our speakers. Gordon Zerby will be doing the Zacchaeus story for us. Sarah Augustine is here. Shalisa Adele Perry, Shalisa Clausen and Adele Perry. So I want to just do a clap for all of the things, all the people that you're bringing your gifts to this space. Thank you so much. There are washrooms downstairs, but if there's an accessibility need, just through that door, there is one restroom in that back space there. We have had people sign up for breakout sessions already, so hopefully that is helping us to kind of organize which spaces we will offer those breakout sessions for this afternoon. And we're glad that the Zoom people can also join us for the in-sanctuary one. So we'll rotate the in-sanctuary breakout room. So there'll be 2 offerings then this afternoon in this space. Also want to just notice the beautiful art and creativity that is around the space. There are calendars from Dieter, and Henry Neufeld has brought his carvings. And just a little note about the wood carvings and Henry's good work up in the north. From 1952 is the date that you were in Moose Lake and Little Grand Rapids. You took some time at Pungassi. So you and Elna were together teaching and just giving your heart to the community. And the Pungassi one seemed very special, that you received an invitation from the community to come and live with us, teach our children, and have church services with us. So you responded to that invitation with a yes. Just grateful for all that experience that you have held and have brought to our community down in the South, and want to keep knowing the story of the North and staying connected. So that your beautiful carvings after retirement, you got really creative and have an offering here for folks. So think about how we can collectivize our energy and think about reparations. So Henry's starting that by offering any donations that would go towards the carving would go towards reparations fund that we could collectively discern together. What are we doing with those monies, and how we can really repair the harm in doing that. I want to introduce Neil and Edith Van Gutten, who will be doing our 4 Directions opening prayer in lieu of Stan McKay not being able to join us. So that is page 864. I invite your participation. So they will come and do an introductory of that. And Neil and Edith, have also wonderfully offered of themselves with their whole lives since the 1970s in many, many northern communities. And we're grateful for the Walking Together book that tells the story of their journey from Chicago after married life and long time Matheson Island, Blood Vein, and Manigatogan. We're just grateful for those connections to the northern community. So I'll invite you up. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just wanted to mention a little bit about the book. We are very honored and yet with trepidation, we agreed that Mennonite Church Canada's invitation to write a book, that we would actually do it. Because it was not to be a memoir, it was to be a book that talked about reconciliation, it talked about what we have learned over the years and inviting other people to go on that journey with us as well. So we're glad it's done. It's given us many opportunities to share with other people, other congregations, and we've enjoyed that so much as well.
I might also add, it's also based on the 7 sacred teachings, which we had to get permission from Indigenous leaders in Manitoba. One was also Stan McKay, who was supposed to be here. Just before we read this prayer, which you are all going to participate in, a few words of why we have it. Edith and I were part of the Riverton Fellowship Circle, and that was made up of Cree, Ojibwe, Métis, also maybe a sprinkling of Icelandic, Ukrainian, and German people. And we were out in the United States in the Northern Cheyenne Reserve, where they had a 4-directional prayer. And after we got back to Riverton, they said, we need to adapt something for our own congregation. And so the prayer that's in the book is, we call it a prayer of thanksgiving, as Barb Daniels, who's from the Peguis Reserve, and myself had written that on behalf of the congregation. I might also add that this is only a short version of the prayer. It wouldn't fit in the whole hymnal, so we just had to downsize it. So it's much bigger than that, but it gives you a bit of a sense of what it should be. And yes. My wife doesn't know how to light a candle. Oh, there we go. Looks like you have to depend upon modern technology. The little match doesn't work. Go ahead and light it. She don't know how to use it. What we have on the table here is a symbol that the congregation has always used with the Bible and the sweetgrass, and then the candle representing Christ is at the center of our circle in Riverton. And so this is a symbol that we had, and we use this prayer every Sunday morning. I would like you. Oh yeah, and we even used it at Mennonite World Conference, and I understand that this prayer has been now translated into other languages and used in other parts of the world as well. Shall we all stand? Turn to 864. I'll be the leader. And this is north. You're facing north already. So I'll lead and then I'll turn. We offer thanksgiving to our Creator, recalling that Christ is the center of creation and our lives as Christians. As we face east, so that's east, the direction of the rising sun, we offer thanks for the gifts of the tree world and for new beginnings.
You and others, and to be wise and just in our use of the resources of the earth. We give thanks to you, O God.
As we face south, where we receive warmth, we offer thanks for the gifts of the animal world and the call for us to be humble.
Enable us to walk good paths, to live as families should, and with you to renew the face of the earth. We give thanks to you, O God.
As we face west, where we receive teachings of faith, we offer thanks for the gifts of the rock world and the purifying and fruitful waters.
Thus, earth through your Holy Spirit, and give us faith as strong as the rock. We give thanks to you.
As we face north, the direction of the wind and snow, we offer thanks for the plant world and for the kindness and wisdom.
Breathe your strength and endurance into us and give us wisdom to treat each other with kindness. We give thanks to you, O God.
As we face the center, or the candle, the Christ candle, which just burnt out, from above comes the unconditional love of God. From the earth comes the gift of life.
Give thanks to love,
like the wings of the eagle. We dedicate our lives to you, our Creator and Savior. As we walk on this earth, may we learn together and celebrate the way of peace, harmony, and tranquility. We give thanks to you, O God. You may be seated. Miigwech.
Thanks so much, Neil and Edith. I'm sure there's a joke somewhere about how many Mennonites it takes to light a candle. Neil and Edith's books are also there. The corner is there, so you can chat with them about it, if you're interested in the books, as well as the many other books. Arlen brought a bunch of books from Common Word, including Sarah's books, and feel free to look around and during the breaks and enjoy each of those. This morning, as we begin to delve into today's topic, we thought it made sense to prepare our hearts and minds with a short biblical reflection that will be offered to us this morning by Gordon Jansen. Gordon Zerby, my apologies. Gord is no stranger to many of us. Up until his retirement earlier this year, Gord was professor of biblical and theological studies at CMU, Canadian Mennonite University, where he continues to be senior scholar. Though I haven't had the opportunity to take any classes with him, I did get to know him over several years as part of a Mennonite Anglican dialogue group, and I very much appreciated his deep biblical knowledge, his thoughtful way of applying it to today, and his good humor. So thanks, Gord, for being willing to come join us today. Appreciate it.
Good morning. It's an honor, even if daunting, to be asked to share some reflections on the story of Zacchaeus as relevant for our deliberations today. At the end of the story of Zacchaeus, in Luke's gospel, Jesus declares, "Today salvation has come to this household, for he too is a son of Abraham. The human one came to seek and to save the lost." In the storyline of this gospel, and the clue to specific episodes in this gospel is especially its overall storyline, the account of Zacchaeus answers the big questions. Is there good news for the rich? Can the rich find salvation? If they can, how do they find salvation? In the early chapters of this gospel, the resounding claim is that the coming kingdom means good news for the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized, since they are God's special clients. Meanwhile, the comfortable and insensitive rich are threatened with judgment, one of the many features of what can be called the social reversals in Luke's Gospels. Those in first class will be pushed to the back of the bus, and those in the back will move to first class. Not unlike the Beatitude statement of Matthew that it will be the humble poor who will inherit the land. Halfway through the story, Jesus declares categorically that no one can become his disciple unless they give up all of their possessions. Still, there's a bit of ambiguity as we read of others, those presumably at least with some financial means, who regularly provide for the subsistence needs of those who have made vows of total divestment. Tension mounts in the story, and toward the end of Jesus' pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a rich magistrate inquires of Jesus as to how he can receive fullness of life in the age to come. The demand is that he sell everything he has and to give the proceeds to the poor. As he walks away in sadness, Jesus declares that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for a rich person to be saved. The disciples, somewhat aghast, respond, "Well, then, who among the rich can ever be saved?" Jesus responds, "What is impossible for humans is possible for God." That is, it may require a miracle to overcome human inertia. And suddenly Jesus is at the gates of Jericho. And the story of Zacchaeus will answer the big question, how can a rich person ever be saved? By the way, there is nothing in Luke's gospel or anything else in the New Testament, for that matter, that says that you can be saved by merely believing. After Jesus has seemingly played favorites by inviting himself to the house of Zacchaeus, giving the usual deference to the morally dubious wealthy elite, and so Jesus and Zacchaeus face the hostility of the crowds. Zacchaeus then says to Jesus, I am giving half of my estate to the poor, and if I find that I have defrauded anyone, I restore it fourfold. In Luke's telling, Zacchaeus uses the present ambiguous tense, not the future tense, and so scholars continue to debate whether these are words of exoneration in the face of communal prejudice, or words of a future resolve and commitment to change. But that debate is perhaps irrelevant. The point of the story has to do with the dramatic commitment expressed by Zacchaeus, constituting grounds for his welcome into the community of those being saved. Curiously, though, Zacchaeus has not given away everything, as Jesus has just demanded of all would-be disciples, or even of the rich magistrate. Still, Zacchaeus has given away half of his estate, far more than the usual tenth on income for supporting the poor, and he has made restitution for any fraudulent gain far beyond the recommended amount in biblical law, which is a merely 20% on top of principal. So what might this story suggest to us today? First, I think the crucial thing is that we read the story through a collectivist lens, refusing to merely individualize the actors or the actions. Zacchaeus is literally Mr. Morally Clean, the meaning of the name Zakkai in Hebrew. Mr. Pure and Innocent is a representative figure standing for a collective social group. He represents the collectivity of the land-owning wealthy who have access to ever-increasing wealth precisely because of their control of land. Indeed, he represents generational wealth through inherited land. Meanwhile, the poor must not be treated merely as the individual poor, but as a collective group that has over time become alienated from the most productive asset in that society, land. Insofar as land is the crucial resource in that predominantly agriculture-based economy, Mr. Clean's resolve to give up half of his wealth means in effect that he will return half of his land to those who have become landless. Granted, he still remains a mighty rich man, but he has begun to move in the right direction. Mr. Clean is undoubtedly aware that a good chunk of the land he now controls is inherited wealth that was generationally stolen. The very productive and lucrative plantations around Jericho, made possible through irrigation from local springs, were the envy of many. That land had changed hands multiple times over the centuries leading up to the time of Mr. Clean. And Jericho is the world's oldest, by the way, continuously occupied city, reaching back 10,000 years to the beginnings of agriculture itself. The mounds of Jericho today reveal the world's first grain silos, the world's first defensive walls, but also some of the world's oldest evidence of warfare. When Alexander the Great conquered the area in 332 BCE, he expropriated the region of Jericho for his own personal estate. As for Mr. Clean, his ancestral claim to land ownership goes back probably to around 100 years earlier than his own time, after the Judean Hasmonean freedom fighters were able to wrest control of the region of Jericho from the Greek Empire centered in Syria. It was only a few years later that Judean Hasmonean dynasts conquered and colonized the region of Galilee, resulting in a massive influx of migrants, no doubt the ancestors of Jesus included. I'm convinced that Jesus' own thinking and acting, including his interaction with Mr. Clean, stems from his awareness of this complicated land history. Jesus himself was a third-generation settler, which I think gives hope for a lot of us. The first part of Mr. Clean's commitment, namely to distribute half of his landed estate to the landless poor, may sound like a merely humanitarian gesture, but it is no less a recognition of an historic injustice as the second part, making restitution far beyond what is recommended in law for continued fraudulent gain. A collective reading of this passage is crucial, but assessing collective responsibility and collective reparations can be a tricky thing. In line with developing jurisprudence across the ancient Near East, the civil and criminal code of Israel pertaining to harm done to someone actually disallows any responsibility and thus punishment or indemnity imposed on a perpetrator's vertical family lines, whether the parents or the children, or even the perpetrator's horizontal family lines, whether siblings or cousins. The main reason for this was to stop the cycle of the blood feud, which operates on the notion of social substitution, where revenge on any close family member will do. These days, the logic of social substitution operates most horrifically in war, and even collective responsibility has historically played out most commonly where the victors in war have the power to impose indemnity, that is reparations, on the collective losers. Despite its complications, though, collective responsibility must always be considered. Even the jurisprudence of the UN now has developed a framework for assessing collective claims of reparations, although the court still seeks to quantify collective harm in terms of the aggregate of individual wrongs and individual victims. So even if we do not think of ourselves as individual perpetrators, collective thinking is a must. I don't think of myself as a greedy person. Need to maybe get a little feedback on that, but I became aware from my late teens as an American who grew up overseas that I'm a beneficiary of a geopolitical and economic system that is greedy on my behalf. And for a while, I thought I could be a benign Canadian until I was confronted by colleagues in the Philippines when I was a visiting professor there, that Canada needs to be included among the imperialist countries of the world. They told me that they despised what I represented, even if I might be okay as a person. Similarly, I don't think of myself as personally sexist or racist, caution there, but I'm still a beneficiary of a system that privileges what I represent. Furthermore, I don't think of myself as having personally stolen land or having contributed to genocide, but I am part of and a beneficiary of a collective history that both enjoys stolen lands and continues to benefit from that historic defrauding. Confessedly, though, I have a quite challenging personal problem in connection with our topic. When my 97-year-old father dies, I am set to inherit with my siblings around 500 acres of land right in the middle of the Fort Peck Indian Reservation in northeastern Montana, where my 4 grandparents and a whole pile of other Mennonites homesteaded in 1916, thanks to the General Allotment Act of 1887. I've been working with my siblings on how we can return that land in some way to the tribal authority. It will not be easy. So may the breath of the Creator inspire and guide us today as we consider our collective and individual next steps in this journey of solidarity and repair. Amen.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Neufeld, Indigenous Relations Coordinator for Mennonite Church Manitoba. And it's my honor to welcome and introduce Sarah Augustine this morning. Currently, Sarah is the Executive Director of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, which she founded with others initially as a movement among Anabaptist congregations to effect systemic change and undo in the name of Christ what has been done in the name of Christ. She was called by the Wayana people of the Suriname to unmask and address the complex international design of colonization. Prior to her current role with the coalition, Sarah was the executive director of the Yakima chapter of the statewide dispute resolution centers, helping her community address inequity, designing programs to address youth gang involvement, and chairing the Washington State bipartisan electoral redistricting process. She teaches, she writes, she shows up, all with a sole focus on building broad-based movements in support of Indigenous priorities, led by Indigenous brilliance and design. Showing those of us involved with her that we come into decolonial work with open hands, and that need to relinquish the impulse to control the interaction and the outcome based on our worldview or the worldview of dominant culture. And in that involvement with her, we're transported into a wondrous world of radical action. For all Sarah does for the movement, our friendship was formed on the land of the Yakima Nation, where Sarah lives as a guest with her family. Over 2 decades working to heal the land from the impacts of industrial agriculture, totally dependent on irrigation from the Columbia River Basin, to a sustainably grazed, dry land, grass-planted, grass-finished beef ranch, which no longer depends on a single drop of irrigation. And in that process of transformation of the land, welcomed the return of biodiversity and wild habitat, with the ultimate goal and hope to negotiate a land return to the Yakima people. On this land, we have harvested and processed choke cherries and elderberry. I learned to brand cattle. We mended fence lines, and we butchered scrawny chickens. Participating in the circle of life and sustainability in a spirit of gratitude for Creator's provision. So this is a much anticipated day and a conversation for folks in Manitoba. And we welcome the call to align our relationships with land to the spirit of life. So Sarah, please. We thought you could speak under the shadow of grandfather. This is the view from Sarah's house on the Yakima Nation. And we offer collectively you this tobacco out of gratitude for your coming and for our collective openness to the spirit of life. Come to us through you and a part of our waiting for us here and with you as you come.
Yeah.
Amen.
Little choked up after that introduction. It's so good to be among you, my kin. I'm a Tewa woman. I'm from the homeland of the Tewa people in what we now call northern New Mexico. Most specifically, to orient myself in place, I'm of the round earth, the people of the round earth. And I'm also a Mennonite woman. You may or may not know. So that's why I greet you. Thank you for your welcome and say, it's good to be among kin. I spend a lot of my life among strangers. I'm traveling around the country and internationally, advocating for Indigenous peoples, my people, for our survival, for our ability to thrive. And it's good to be home among my kin, which is what you are. Grateful and thankful to be here with you and among you. And so I'm wondering, this is a little bit unusual, but I'm wondering if you would be willing to just reach out and just touch a person by you and just acknowledge that we're kin. Hey. We're family, called together as the body of Christ. I want to begin by acknowledging Lorraine Daniels, who is the executive director of the National Indigenous Residential School Museum of Canada, because Lorraine was the first person, other than Jonathan and Melanie, who picked me up at the airport, that I got to interact with here. And Lorraine and her team are doing an important work. And I want to shout out to her, and then maybe in this conversation or sometime throughout the day, imagine together with you how this part of us may be able to support Lorraine and that important work, which is the first step of repair, telling the truth. I want to talk to you today, though, from my identity as a farmer. And in order to do that adequately, I have to first introduce you to my partner, my husband, Dan Peplow, who joins us today on Zoom from White Swan, Washington. And I have to acknowledge here that Dan, my partner, is the true architect to this transformation that's happened on the land where we've lived these past 18 years among the Yakima people. And that I tell this story only today as a helper. I don't get to own that identity or that work. It was Dan's vision and work and labor that has enabled that place and carries on. So I salute you, Dan, this morning. I can't see you because our treasured mountain, Pato, is on the screen, so I can't see your face, but I know you're there. Some of you know a little about my story. I'm not going to go into all of that here, but I came to, oh, thank you. I wasn't sure where to put it. Thank you. When I came to live among the Yakima, I had no context for living on the land. I'm not from an agricultural background, although my people, the Tewa people, were agriculturalists, raising the 4 sacred plants, beans and tobacco, and corn and squash, those 4 plants that are sacred to our people. But I grew up in Albuquerque, an urban Indian, So living on the lands of the Yakima was my first time being around and among and within these processes of growing with an environment. And my husband, Dan, was the one that introduced me to how to live in a good way in that place. So I just want to ask you if you would be willing to raise your hand if you come from an agricultural background or if you yourself are a farmer or have been part of that. My relatives, yes. You know what I'm talking about. So the story I want to talk about today from my life is a complicated story. And as I'm looking at you, I know that your stories are complicated too, because living on the land is complicated. Dealing with markets and weather is complicated. Living within a colonial structure is complicated. And there is no easy way to talk about it. So we'll do it the hard way. We'll talk about it the hard way. Hey, because that's the real talk, trying to reason together. Well, anyhow, I came to living on the land. I'm going to start a little bit here in Romans 1:20. Some of you may be familiar with that text. It's a little bit can be some trigger warning there. Some people don't love Romans, but anyway, I'm going to drive on ahead here. Here we go. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. God's eternal power and divine nature. What do we learn about God's eternal power and divine nature from living on land? Right? This creation that we are a part of, that is with us and among us and within us. We are it, it is us. I've been taught to pray. Thank you for this land, our body. Not thank you for this land that nourishes us, or thank you for this land that's beautiful, or thank you for this land that inspires us. Thank you for this land, our body, our body. Okay. What I've learned, well, I share with you humbly about the eternal power and divine nature of our Creator is faithfulness. Every spring, life returns to the soil while we do nothing to earn that. The pollinators show up, continue to bring us the cycle of life that we see in the soil. The sacred waters flow. In that water cycle, in spite of the pollution that we put into our aquifers. I also notice and have lived into mutual dependence. As Dan, my partner, was building up the soil on our place, I learned in an indigenous cosmology to call those microbes in the soil that we depend on the invisible ones. That community of life that we don't fully understand, that is making it possible for us to produce food. The winged ones that we depend on to seed and reseed native forbs and shrubs and plants. Many of those things have to pass through a bird in order to be viable in the soil. The insect people, those people most denigrated. We have a wetland, 7 acres of wetland on our place. And so, the original settlers wanted to drain that away, make that productive soil. Anyway, I'll tell you about having 7 acres of wetland. There's a lot of mosquitoes. And we're thankful for them. They feed the swallows. Hey. And the insect people are not just sort of a bother to us. They're the little trash people of creation. They're breaking things down, not mosquitoes necessarily, but many others. They're breaking things down and making it possible for waste to become soil. For the cattle themselves, our partners on the land, those cattle that are part of a cycle of regeneration on that land, feeding the soil as they consume it, feeding the soil as they consume grass from the soil, and those animals that make it possible for us to be there. Yeah, living in this web of mutual dependence. I have learned about the eternal power and divine nature of our Creator. These values of faithfulness and mutual dependence, that these things are obvious, that they're present and available in creation, that we don't have to look far to find those things. Even I've been taught to pray that when I'm standing on the land, God is not far from me, right there in the soil, present constantly for everyone, enabling rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Hey. What do we do about this returning wealth? That's the question. So as the crowd warmer was speaking this morning, there you are. I'm looking at your name tag. Gordon, as Gordon was speaking this morning, I kind of moved my notes around. You probably thought I was texting with a friend, but no, I was like, oh, I have to respond to what Gordon is saying. I was writing recently about counting the cost. Do you know about counting the cost? Luke chapter 14. People say, oh, you're going to do a hard thing. First, you have to count the cost. We're talking that way as sensible people, people of the land. And we're saying, oh, we're going to return some wealth, but we have to count the cost because you have to understand the full impact of what you're doing before you do it. That's what sensible people do. So I'm going to look at Luke 14 for just a minute. Well, just go down this rabbit hole with me. Thanks, Gordon. Okay. I'm going to read it. I hope that's not tedious. Thank you, relatives, for indulging this unfiltered, new sort of thinking. So this is Jesus talking here, who says, anyone comes to me and does not hate their father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. That's what Gordon was talking about. How do we deal with that? And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Okay, that seems pretty unambiguous and clear. So the next part feels confusing. Let's try that out. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Does that make sense? We're going to build a tower. First, we have to figure out how much that's going to cost. For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying the person began to build and wasn't able to finish. So we open up ourselves to criticism if we're not sensible and careful in the way that we, carefully sit down and plan how we're going to do it, right? We don't want to open up ourselves to ridicule and shame. That would be unacceptable. Maybe not for you, but for many Mennonite people I know, that's like the big dark fear is shame and ridicule. And so I'm going on, verse 31, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. This doesn't sound like Mennonites at all. But anyway, here we go. This is Jesus talking. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he would send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciples. What? That has to do with the first part, but what does it have to do with the second part? Because, right, he's saying you have to give up everything, and then he says, oh, but be sensible, you have to count the cost. But then he goes back here and says, well, just exactly in this way, if you don't give up everything, you cannot be my disciples. I don't get it. Yeah, I'm wondering. And then he says, oh my gosh, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. What the heck? You just told us two things that are contradictory to each other. So this is what I learned in Sunday school growing up. Maybe some of you did, I don't know. That when we count the cost, Jesus is telling us, be reasonable. Before you build the tower, count the cost. But I ask you this, who builds the tower? Do we, Mennonite people, build a tower? Do we build a tower? Do we go to war? Do we say, oh, before we raise an army, let's figure out if it's cost effective, this war? Do we do that? That is not about us, friends. This counting the cost nonsense is for empire. Hey, counting the cost, that's empire. That's what empire does. Jesus says here, you'll give up everything. No questions asked. Those people who will be my disciples will take up their cross and follow me, which means what? You might open yourself up to ridicule. You might lose. I have to tell you, when I began my journey as a woman living on land and as an advocate for my people, which is not something I ever imagined I would be, I had no idea what the cost would be, friends. Now I know. I've given decades of my life, my body, all of my wealth, all of my financial security, my safety. I've given it all. I know what that cost is now. And I want to tell you that younger me would not have understood it or chosen it if she did understand. Do you really think Jesus is telling us, be sensible, first decide whether it's worth it? That is not the message that I understand from Jesus. Well, not in Luke chapter 14 anyway. I've kind of puzzled over this one. I think we're being asked to leap into the abyss. where we relinquish control, what we believe that we can understand as individuals, and leap into a different way of knowing. That way of knowing that is in collaboration with the spirit of life. That spirit that guides us and animates us. What else on earth is worth living for? We give up our birthright, this ability to be fully human, this ability to be in true union and communion with all of creation, so that we can have financial security, so that we can appear to be decent people with a good home and a safe retirement and a college tuition for our youth. Those aren't bad things, but those things are so costly to my people. Hey, our 401ks are invested in oil and gas extraction, gold and lithium, copper, all of the extractives that destroy the potential and possibility for Indigenous people to live in a good way. Okay, anyway, I told you I was going to talk as a farmer. Sorry, I got off on that. I blame Gordon. I got off the track there. I want to tell you how we came to be on this farm. First of all, it's deed land on a reservation. So how does that even happen? Yeah, it's possible in the United States to buy land on a reservation, deed land. And I won't go into all the reasons why, but Gordon knows. He talked a little about the Allotment Act and how that all happens. Yeah. So we were working, we being Dan and me, were working in the context of Indigenous rainforest people in the Guiana Shield, which is in northern South America. And that work was dangerous. Our partners there did not want us to move there or live there because they felt our ability to be effective would be compromised if we lived there, since it's such a dangerous place to be an activist for Indigenous people. So we thought, well, we're working with Indigenous peoples. We want to live in an Indigenous context. And we chose to move to the Yakima Reservation. My husband's family settled there. They're homesteaders. So I think he's fourth generation on that side, on his mother's side of the family. And we went with this idea that we would seek right relationship. Are you familiar with these words, right relationship? You know what I'm talking about? Relatives, my Mennonite relatives. Yeah, we sort of think about shalom is right relationship, balancing power. Okay. So we thought, we're going to seek right relationship with Indigenous people on the reservation. I'm not going to go into the details of the devastating story that helped me to arrive at the conclusion that there is no way to be in right relationship with people who are oppressed unless there is structural change to laws and policies. There is no way that with my good intentions or my loving heart, I can be in right relationship with the people that are absolutely earmarked for annihilation. That it actually requires my commitment to structural change. That I can't live on a reservation with a people oppressed, believing that sharing produce from my garden or beef or whatever else is actually righting any kind of power imbalance, that actually it becomes my job to balance power. Hey. Seeking right relations means giving up power for those people that benefit from oppression. So an interesting thing about living in settler colonialism is that if you are someone who is lucky, wins the lottery of birth to be the descendant of settlers, you do not have to do anything to benefit from structural injustice. All you have to do is breathe in and out. It actually takes effort to make a commitment to undo that. And if you're not making a commitment to undo that, then you are affirming it. That's what puts the rich and the powerful in a difficult position because you have to proactively do a thing. The oppressed, people like me, we don't have to do anything because we're like already in that. Hey, I mean, for me, my eyes are open because I'm living under the structure of oppression. I know all about it. Yeah, what I'm trying to do is help you to know all about it too. Not for my liberation, but for yours. Decolonization is relinquishing control of a subjugated people. Decolonization is relinquishing control of a subjugated people. Relinquishing control of a subjugated people. Systems of control must be dismantled by the beneficiaries of oppression, and that means laws and policies. How does a church embark on this? How does the collective, as Gordon has said, because what's required of us is as a collective. How do we do this collectively? And in the coalition to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, we use a framework of repair, following reparative justice, repair. How do you engage in repair? If, for example, my child rambunctiously runs through my living room and knocks over a priceless vase, something that is an heirloom that's been in my family, and it shatters on the wooden floor. Is it repair if he buys me a new vase? What do you think? It's not the same, eh? Well, what about if he glues it back together with super glue? Also not the same vase. How do we begin to engage in repair? Maybe repair is not a vase. Hey, but I know that we're not going to be able to come up with repair unless he and I sit down together and figure out what repair looks like. Because repair is in the context of relationship. And it has to be led by the context of the injured party. So my son can't come to me and say, Mom, I offer you in repair this thing that is important to me, which is my kazoo. Here's my kazoo for you. And it's like, well, you don't need a kazoo. He's like, well, I don't have access to a priceless vase, so this is what I have to give you. Well, we have to figure out together, what is it going to be? And in fact, maybe what would be is something completely different. Maybe I'd want him to sit with me for many weekends in a row to learn about why that vase was precious to me and that he might be transformed by that. Maybe that's what repair is for me. Hey, we have to get there together, agree together what that might be like. Once we have embarked on the pathway of repair, then and only then is it possible for a person who has been in this situation of damage to consider forgiveness. You know, when you ask for forgiveness, it's really the thing that is the hardest thing for a person to give. And for a person who's in a position of power, to ask the most precious, difficult thing in the world of a vulnerable person is a crazy idea. And yet we do this all the time. Forgiveness is something that can be embarked on in the context of relationship. Okay, I started telling you about land and farming. Let's talk about that for a minute. Living in the reservation on the homeland of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakama Nation for nearly 2 decades has been a commitment to living in conflict. We have been in conflict every moment that we have been on that land. Embarking on the restoration that was required to rehabilitate that soil and land. And I want to say, we didn't sort of figure out, hey, what does this look like to us? We did it in collaboration with the Yakama Nation Fish and Wildlife, that part of their own government system, to figure out what repair looked like to them. It's their homeland. What is repair? We worked together with soil scientists and folks from their own context, and we invested our own money in restoring this land to their specifications. And by doing so, devalued the land from the point of view of the dominant culture. We buried the main line. Anybody here irrigate? You know about irrigation. So we had irrigation on the surface and we buried it to still there. That irrigation system is still possible. We have risers there, but what it does is it cuts down on erosion. And anyway, it was a good thing that we did. But then others say, oh, well, you don't really have access to water there. It's like, well, it costs a lot of money and it was pretty good thing for the land. When we first started out, we had a loan, new farmer's loan from the Farm Service Agency. And so that's our annual loan, the operation loan. Anybody here ever had an operation loan? Yeah, or your family, someone? No? Yes. Well, anyway, it's possible, unless you have historical wealth, somehow you have to be able to operate. And what the model that we were using is that you get a loan once a year, you operate, then you harvest, and then you pay off that loan and you have something at the end, right? And so because we're taking money from the federal government in the United States, they had, like any bank, control over what we're doing on our land. And they said, you could really double your production. And we said, we don't really want to double our production because we're trying to restore the soil and we're doing fine. We're able to pay our loan every year. So we don't need to double our production. And they said, oh, but you will double your production. You will double your production. We said, wow, we buried our main line. We stopped, this erosion. We're restoring the soil. All that requires low stocking rates. And they said, you will do it or you will not receive another loan. And we thought, well, what they don't know won't hurt them. Because it's not like they get it, whatever. They're just the lender. Well, anyway, they did know. And they dropped our loan, which means we can't operate, right? Then what? What would you guys do if you lost your operations loan? Jonathan and Melanie were there. They know this story. Yeah, that's what we did. We called on our Mennonite kin who, cobbled some money together and gave us an operations loan. And within several years, we were able to pay that all back. We earned enough profit over years to be able to return it completely so that we wouldn't need it anymore. Thank you, all the Mennonite people who were willing to be on that journey with us and believed in soil restoration more than market economy. Conserving water in our context is also something that is absolutely not honored by the government or any system. In fact, our little place, 200 acres, conserves 1% of the conservation plan for the entire valley, which is millions of acres. And yet, we are still expected to pay for water and do not have any credit for conserving water. So the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we invested into soil conservation, we are penalized for through taxes and et cetera. Dan and I have been in a lawsuit of one kind or another for all 18 years of living in the context of the Yakama Nation. I remember at one point being really tired, and I said to Dan, I don't want to do this anymore. This is hard. I'm so tired. We haven't, we haven't figured out right relationship. That requires a lot more work. And he said, Sarah, we came here to fight. Let's fight. Whoop-de-doo. Okie dokie. That's the long-term investment, eh? That's picking up your cross, following. Yeah, that's what we came here to do. And I'm telling you all about it. Why? I'm telling you all about it. What is the point of going and doing all that stuff if I don't turn to you and say, this is our story. This is what we learned. We learned that Undoing oppression is not a simple little thing. That the model of charity is absolutely inappropriate. What is charity? Charity is when I say, I have done what I need to do with my life. I have gained enough security for myself. I've hoarded enough security for myself that I have leftovers that I'm willing to share with you, less fortunate people. That's charity. A model that reinforces power and balance. A. In order to balance power, it means giving up power, giving up land. A. That's what that is, giving up wealth. There's no simple solution here. Thanks, Zacchaeus. He was willing to give up 50%, and I like that. I like that about Zacchaeus. I've preached a Zacchaeus sermon a couple times. I think I've written about it. I don't know. Someone else here may know. I think in a magazine article once. I mean, imagine. Do you think that was easy to give up half? He said he would give up half, and then he said, oh, and then and out of my half, I'll restore 4 times if I have cheated someone. That's a lot of money. Yeah, that's balancing power. It's acknowledging the privileged position and willingly stepping away from the spoils of that position. We struggled together with the first people of the land in the Yakima context and the water protectors there. We lean into mutual dependence, a true acknowledgement of mutual dependence, not an abstract idea of mutual dependence, not a tagline in a newsletter, not a Sunday sermon or a children's time, but actual mutual dependence and understanding that your survival and mine are intertwined. If you people of the Yakima Nation cannot survive and thrive, then I cannot survive and thrive. This structure of laws and policies the federal government and my country imposes on you is now the structure of laws and policies the federal government imposes on me. So the damage to you is the damage to me. The conservation of water in that context for corporate extractive farming impacts me. Water is hoarded in that context, so the big, large industrial agricultural players can have it to the detriment of family farms, and that is now the detriment to me because I have put myself in the position to find common cause, and we call that crossing the line. I am no longer offering you charity. I have now put myself in the position that you are in, and in so doing, discovered salvation. What do we get? A lot poorer. But we get to experience our own humanity. That's what we have had the opportunity to do, experience our own humanity. Through relationship, ongoing relationship with Noah's Ark, which is the homeless shelter there that we have been delivering beef to every Tuesday for years and well till the end of time, or at least until there are no more cows. Our relationship with a dear friend, Nathan, a former student who has traveled with me. He's an elder, former student at the university there on the reservation, has traveled with me to the UN and all the way back to being a subsistence fisher person, which is what Nathan was to begin with, and in trading salmon that nourishes our family and our bodies as we stand with Nathan in defense of fishing rights for the Yakima Nation. Our survival is bound up together, and I get to know unequivocally with certainty that I am not alone. And I'm not the center. Hey, I'm not the center. I can't solve it, but I have to do something. This is mutual dependence, is it? Understanding I'm not the center, and everything I do matters. Everything I do has a consequence and an impact on everyone else, but that doesn't mean I'm the center of the world. I'm one of many, alive now, the descendant of many, and the progenitor of many more. And that is my commitment, my place in the family of things, and your place in the family of things. The gospel offers us a vision of all of creation restored. All of creation restored. All of creation restored. Not some small thing, not some thin thing, my own financial well-being, but all of creation restored. How will we be a part of it? Psalm 24 says, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord, for he laid its foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. Joel 2 says, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locusts have eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, the great army sent among you. That is good news for my people. Revelation 21 says, he who was seated on the throne said, I am renewing everything. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. That is what we have the opportunity to live into with the Creator, the Spirit of life. Not some small thin thing, not some small individual thing, some aspiration that absolutely neglects the rest of creation and those that come after us. We have the opportunity to live into fullness of life with all of creation. Amen.
Just invite us to get out of our heads and sink back into our bodies, to take in a breath, to shake out an arm, shake out the other arm, shake out a leg, shake out the other leg, shake out your voice. Shake out what you sit on, which is hard when you're sitting on it. Coming back to our full humanity includes being a body. So I'm grateful for all that Sarah has offered, Gordon, you have offered. We have a time for a break now. We want to also collect our questions, noticing that there's probably questions on the chat. Though I don't think we have enough time to really delve into those. We have a lot of time later after we hear from Adele Perry and Shalisa later on. So we're going to kind of condense our time now to give us a full break and get some nourishment. So that is all downstairs. The coffee, the fruit, the muffins, the food that you all brought. So thank you for your contribution to our break times, our nourishment, so that we can remember again that we are fully human in this space and we are being called into breaking down the structures of oppression. Whew, that's a big task. That's a big weight for our bodies. So glad we can be in community together on all of that. So we have till 10:45. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself and come back for our local input time and then our question and chewing on all of what we have heard. Thank you.
Study. All right, so, okay. let's wait a second. This is also an important conversation for me as someone not only from Treaty 1, but specifically from the West Reserve, the West Mennonite Reserve in southern Manitoba. So the question about Mennonites and land is a personal one for me as well. Okay, go to my first slide. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to begin with explaining some maps. So we're talking about land. I think it's important to situate ourselves within that land. And so maps are always inherently political, right? What we choose to put on a map and choose to not put on a map is a matter of the politics and worldview of those creating the maps. So this first map it looks at Manitoba in the 1870s. As you can see, it's a small postage stamp of a province in 1870. There are minimal landmarks recorded on this map, which suggests perhaps that it is empty, but it is not. The map, or the few indicators of people on this map, aside from the forts, are the Red River cart trails that are indicated, because those are useful for settlers. Everything else that is important to the people who live here is, of course, not included on this map. And our next map, if you don't mind. Here we go. This shows really where the population is in Manitoba in the 1870 census, 1871 census. It is largely located along the rivers in parishes. This is because Manitoba was an Indigenous space in 1870, and the census only recorded certain types of indigeneity, specifically people who were living in houses and who were settled. So a good number of Métis families were included, but not all. One or two communities of First Nations, specifically St. Peter's, because they were farmers, are included in the census. And then, of course, the settlers are included in the census. And then let's go to the next map. All right, and this is the map you'll just get to look at for the rest of the time while I'm talking, basically. This shows what the change that happens during the 1870s, which is, of course, what I'll be talking about today. Essentially, you can see the way that the land in Manitoba gets divided up in a series of reserves set aside for the different types of land use envisioned in this province. Okay, so Manitoba was an Indigenous space in 1870 when it becomes a province of Canada. Only a little over 10% of the census population, which is around 1,500 people, were identified as white. So 10% are identified as white. That is an overrepresented 10% because, like I mentioned, not everyone is recorded in the census. Fewer than 1,000 people, for example, were recorded as First Nations, which is a drastic undercount. And that is because the only First Nations people who were counted were settled and living in houses. What I want us to understand is that even in the undercounted misrepresentations of Manitoba from its first census, this place is Indigenous. The land is Indigenous, and that is the context that begins this province. But within a decade, much of the land will end up in the hands of settlers. And that's what I'm here to talk about in this first section of local input. I'll be explaining how the land changes hands and the circumstances that led to land being taken from Indigenous nations and given to immigrant settlers, which involved the creation of systems of settler colonial control over the land, and then recruiting settlers to occupy and populate the recently vacated land. And then Adele will carry on from there and how that occupation is maintained. Put simply, settler colonialism refers to the process by which people from one society intend to permanently occupy Indigenous lands and create institutions and systems to uphold those claims. This is a violent process, which often, but not always, results in the elimination of people from power, if not altogether. Essentially, settler colonialism destroys in order to replace. And in Manitoba, this process of destruction and replacement is largely conducted through two laws, or sets of laws, the Indian Act and the Dominion Lands Act. In 1872, the Dominion Lands Act divides the land in all of Western Canada between land for individuals, land for colonization companies, many of which are represented here in the reserves, land for the Hudson's Bay Company, land for railway construction, land for municipalities, and land for religious groups. First Nations land reserves are also set aside, but to be administered separately from the Dominion Lands Act. And the Métis land issue was settled through the scrip system, which I'll discuss more in a moment. The Indian Act was created in 1876 as a means of managing First Nations and the reserve lands. Under the Indian Act, First Nations with Indian status were not permitted to be landowners and were not considered people under Canadian law. This was a sharp turn from how early treaty signatories understood their land reserves and their role within that relationship. In the 1870s, settlers regularly complained that despite the creation of reserves, First Nations people still moved freely around the prairie and in and out of towns and cities. This indicates the different understandings of what the reserve system was meant to do. The reserves were understood by First Nations to be a land base, but they expected to be able to use and remain on the rest of the land that was also their home. Settlers, alternatively, understood the reserves to be all that was left for Indigenous peoples and for them to no longer be present on the remainder of the land. The Indian Act policies enforced by the newly created Northwest Mounted Police began to confine people to reserves so that settlers could use the land without needing to be reminded of the ongoing presence of First Nations people. The Métis during this time expected to have their own land base set aside for them, as was negotiated in the Manitoba Act, which created the province of Manitoba. In reality, the Métis Nation's claims to land in Manitoba were thwarted. And so you can see the claims here in the light green, I suppose. So that's meant to be what is called the half-breed reserve land, but we'll talk about how that doesn't really end up in their hands. So the Métis Nation's claims to land in Manitoba were thwarted as a result of retaliatory violence from 1870 onward. This was called the Reign of Terror by the St. Paul newspaper, observing across the border into what was happening in Manitoba. English soldiers and settlers had moved to Manitoba to try to put the Métis Nation in their place for daring to rise up against Canada's expansion project. While Louis Riel and many of his fellow leaders fled for their lives, hundreds of Métis families remained behind and bore the brunt of the violence against them. When the Red River Expeditionary Force, led by Colonel Garnet Wolseley, arrived in Winnipeg, they were reportedly paid off and given 3 days license where they partnered with their Canadian settler allies and, quote, carried out armed raids and evictions while raping, assaulting, abducting, and lynching the Métis residents of Red River with impunity. This violence lasted beyond those 3 days and for years after the invasion. This regular mob violence against the Métis Nation specifically acted as a sundering event. Parishes were separated from each other, families were separated from each other, as movement in their home territory was dangerous. Soldiers and settlers committed this violence against the Métis with impunity. During this military occupation, the Métis were forced out of sections of Winnipeg or Manitoba that had always been their homes in a system of urban apartheid that left the Métis confined east of the Red River and south of the Assiniboine. The Métis did form armed groups of up to 200 people to try and resist this apartheid system, but there was more than one Canadian soldier for every 10 residents of Winnipeg, and so the military occupation and violence remained. This violence was particularly present around the location of the Dominion Lands Office, which is important because we're talking about land today and how land changes hands. And in a settler colonial state, it often does so through bureaucratic means. But what I hope to communicate is that those bureaucratic means are enforced, in this case in Manitoba, literally through mob violence. The Lands Office, where every claim to homestead or scrip land needed to be filed was located inside Fort Garry, next to the military barracks, where the Red River Expeditionary Force was also stationed. In fact, all the government offices of Manitoba were located in the military fort next to the barracks. And this is the area where many of the violent clashes regularly occurred on a sometimes daily basis. This means that accessing land information was challenging, to say the least, as soldiers were, quote, liable to assault any Métis who came to the fort. The Lands Office was also often staffed with former Red River Expeditionary Force soldiers. So the same people committing the violence are the ones you have to now talk to file your land claim. And even if a Métis claimant managed to face down the risk of violence and managed to get assistance to look into their claim, many found that their claims had already been fraudulently claimed by settlers or speculators who had forged their signatures. This is, of course, assuming that the Métis applicants could even access service, as the Land Office regularly replaced any French-speaking officer or clerk with English-only speakers who would not conduct any business in French, despite many Métis families being unable to speak or read English. Through a combination of violence, underhanded legal maneuvering, and outright scams, the Métis Nation loses their land base to the gradual incoming settlers, which is why the land that is marked in green here as Métis reserve land is largely today held by those settlers. So where do the Mennonites come in? Because we show up during this time. And Mennonites arrived to Manitoba with at least some awareness of this ongoing tension. When the first Mennonite delegation visits Manitoba in 1873, they are confronted by Métis representatives, much in the way that soldiers attempting to access their land claims were also regularly confronted by the Métis anytime they left the military-occupied Winnipeg area, because during this time, there had not been a full shift in power outside of the city of Winnipeg. So leaving the city meant entering into Métis-controlled lands. The Mennonite reserves, as you can see, were located strategically. Both the East and West reserves were located on land that other settlers did not find appealing, largely due to the lack of trees and water. But both reserves also served to shift demographics and provide a population buffer in strategically important areas, securing eastern Manitoba and southern Manitoba along the border with loyal, peaceful residents who were not French and not Catholic, and who were expected to be good farmers. The Mennonites, whether fully aware or not, entered into the politically complicated push and pull between Canada and the Métis Nation, as Canada was desperately trying to shift the demographics of the electorate and political stakeholders in the new province. During Lord Dufferin's 1877 visit to Manitoba, he made many speeches to local communities. The tone of these speeches was generally to confirm the importance of Manitoba and the Northwest to the British Empire, and using poetic, racist language about Indigenous peoples to communicate that Canada's prosperity was now extending beyond the woods of Ontario. The speech to the Mennonites in particular focused on Mennonite inclusion in the new colonial order, saying, quote, "The war to which we invite you as recruits and comrades is a war waged against the brute forces of nature. But those forces will welcome our domination and reward our attack by placing their treasures at our disposal. It is a war of ambition, for we intend to annex territory after territory. But neither blazing villages nor devastated fields will mark our ruthless track. Our battalions will march across the illimitable plains which stretch before us as sunshine steals athwart the ocean. The rolling prairie will blossom in our wake, and corn and peace and plenty will spring where we have trod." Now, this overtly militaristic speech may seem out of place in a speech given to the pacifist audience of Mennonites, which Lord Dufferin was well aware of. But the goal of the speech was to communicate how Mennonites fit into the narrative of Canadian colonialism. In fact, our pacifism was central to this point, as evident in the language just before this quote that I read, which clarified that, quote, "Nor will you be called upon in the struggle to stain your hands with human blood, a task which is so abhorrent to your religious feelings." So no bloodshed, just conquering. The Mennonite aversion to direct violence was well known, and yet they were recruited into the annexation of territory and seen as valuable allies in the shared mission of conquering land in Manitoba. My next slide here. Thank you. The slide comes from Donovan Giesbrecht's article, Métis, Mennonites, and the Unsettled Prairie, and I find this a very helpful map. Largely because taken in context with my other research, indicates that Mennonite land was certainly important to the Métis Nation. This map reveals in the shaded area the location of land claims that were made, basically that Mennonites were occupying Métis land. Asserting this claim, and this claim was asserted repeatedly over decades in the East Reserve, reveals that there is a longer history here, because we know that the land office processes were inaccessible to the vast majority of Métis families. So the fact that there are any recorded land disputes at all speaks to how serious the problem was, given the barriers in place to even make those claims in the first place. So Mennonites in the 1870s were held up as the solution to many of Manitoba's troubles, as Manitoba struggles to recruit immigrants to come to this place. And this place, which was an Indigenous base and remains so, was proving challenging to mold into the British Canadian model. Governments at all levels were willing to grant Mennonites land and then assist them in developing that land in order to make the Mennonites more successful. Shannon Spendenbauer has written about this, explaining that the governments freely offered funding for large-scale drainage projects to make the Mennonite land more profitable. And while Mennonites were receiving these privileges, the process of Métis reserve land was undermined at every level due to racism and revenge for the Red River resistance. Mennonites thus became part of the national myth-making in these early decades in Manitoba, because labeling the Mennonites as for the first settlers makes for a better story than telling the conflicted reality of violent soldier settlers and their lynch mobs, and the racist retaliatory Canadian militias who preceded the Mennonites. The Mennonites then serve as a distraction from the colonial violence of Manitoba and the colonial violence that built this place, which the Mennonites entered into, perhaps not as direct actors, but certainly as strategic tools, right, as recruits and comrades in the war of ambition. So that brings me to, I guess, the end of the 1870s and how land changes hands. And I'll turn it over to Adele to carry the story on. But I did forgot. But now I remembered.
Well, I want to begin by thanking the many organizers of today's events for this opportunity to have this really significant conversation, which is significant within this particular community, but I think is also significant within the context of Manitoba and Canada as a whole. I want to thank Sarah Augustine for, I think, a really powerful kind of call to thinking differently and living in relation, and what that actually means beyond kind of sometimes the easiest invocations of that. And I also want to say what a pleasure it is to present with Dr. Shalisa Clausen. And you've just had a window into the real significance of her research for thinking about Manitoba in the present, but in particular for really unpacking what exactly happened in the 1870s and 80s, which are decades which are absolutely crucial, but are poorly understood. And that's for reasons that reflect something about what happened in those decades. But it's understanding it, I think, has enormous implications for how we kind of live in the difficult colonial present as Indigenous folks, as non-Indigenous people. And I was remembering one thing about Dr. Clausen's discussion of the Reign of Terror, and this is a point raised by our colleague, Dr. Erin Millions, that we can also really locate the beginnings of MMIWG2S in that particular history. So just to begin, Adele Perry Nadishnikas, Gawin Nidudemsi, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganashkwe Ninda. My name is Del Perry. I live in Winnipeg. I am a non-Indigenous white settler woman. I grew up in Coast and Strait Salish territories and Kwakwaka'wakw territories on the West Coast. I've lived here in Treaty 1 since 2000, which is a long time, but it is where I have taught at the University of Manitoba and raised 2 children, and it's very much my home. And what I want to talk about today is some of the way what I'll think about here, and I'll suggest to you to think about, is the slow violence of settler colonialism. Works to render the histories that Dr. Clausen spoke about, that were also referred to in our kind of opening land acknowledgement today, works to render some of those histories easily invisible to non-Indigenous people. And in doing so, works to kind of cement and perpetuate a politics of inequality, which over centuries and decades has worked to attribute wealth and resources to non-Indigenous people, and to particular certain groups of non-Indigenous people, and to strip those from Indigenous peoples. And it has also worked to make living within those worlds for settler folks, including the ones that I come from, make it seem natural, inevitable, and as if it could be no other way. I think, like many of you, I grew up at the end of the residential school era. I inherited and lived within a world which was built on a kind of a very daily practice of segregation, but where that practice was also kind of occluded from us in the way that our lives were organized, and where some of the things that were most striking and most significant to making that world were also produced as hard for us to see. And of course, they were not hard for Indigenous people to see. Indigenous peoples lived and continue to live in the teeth of this violence. But for those of us who won the luck of the lottery that Sarah Augustine spoke of earlier and occupied these spaces as settlers, these have been processes of learning and relearning that are complicated and ongoing, and are full, I think, also of grief for a lot of people, and learning to think about our own lives and that of our families and the places we live in different ways that are actually costly for us and should be. So what I want to sort of talk about is some of the particular kind of 20th century histories, or the very end of the 19th century, processes that worked to kind of cement in, to lock in, and to fortify the transition of wealth and of authority and of power and of land that Dr. Clausen talked about. And I want to think about this both in the context of thinking about settler colonialism, as Patrick Wolf, an Australian scholar, famously said, a structure and not an event, but also one of slow violence. And this is a term that comes from Rob Nixon, who's writing about environmental change, but I think we can bring that understanding in here. And of course, none of this is separable from environmental change. And he writes, "We are accustomed to conceiving of violence as immediate and explosive, erupting into instant concentrated visibility. But we need to revisit our assumptions and consider the relative invisibility of slow violence. I mean a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but instead incremental, whose calamitous repercussions are postponed for years or decades or centuries." And I think for many of us, it is attending to those processes, to that violent colonial process, that is particularly significant if we're to understand the world that we have inherited and that we must move through. So I want to talk about a couple of really quite spectacularly boring and kind of administrative aspects of modern settler colonialism in the context of Manitoba, and in particular Winnipeg. And that is histories of migration and immigration, which are connected to policy, the provision of municipal water supply, and also urban planning. So if I can get the first slide up, I think they should be, it should all kind of work out there. So the first slide on your right, I'm not good at left and right. That one right there represents a Métis waterman with a Red River cart, a characteristic form of Indigenous genius, transportation, lots of other things. Winnipeg, the meeting of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers is a great place to get to from somewhere and to go from somewhere. It's not the place that you would probably choose if you were thinking of good drinking water. And from the outset, accessing meaningful forms of good drinking water was an issue. Indigenous folks who have lived here since time immemorial had, of course, ways of doing that. That included working to still water on their lands. That included boiling water at specific times of the year. But those practices came under real stress as the process of land transfer and transfer of populations that occurred in the 1870s and 80s occurred in these territories. And in Winnipeg in the 1870s and 80s, if you had the resources, you got your water from a waterman, a guy like this. And some of you will remember there used to be a street downtown called Water Street. It's now been renamed, but that's where the watermen had their shops. But that came under stress as I think a number of things happen. And one of them is the arrival of significant numbers of non-Indigenous peoples and the arrival of those folks within a context where they are disassociated from Indigenous communities and knowledge. And that means a number of things, but one of them is that they don't know how to look after the water. And as a result, Winnipeg is kind of beset with annual outbreaks of typhoid, which becomes a real cause for concern and kind of an object of civic shame. And for those of you who are modern day Winnipeggers, you're probably familiar with this kind of anxiety around Winnipeg's urban status as a place. It's old, let me tell you that. And in that context, there is a search for an additional water supply, and that search brings Winnipeg's municipal government back to an old idea that had been long been floated, which was to build an extraordinarily expensive piece of infrastructure tying the city of Winnipeg to the Lake of the Woods watershed in its westernmost context, which is at Shoal Lake. There was an incredibly expensive and politically costly process that was engaged in by the city's municipal government, in particular led by Mayor Thomas Rasdekan, who successfully fundraised and galvanized support for this plan to build an aqueduct. And here's the first sketch map of what that aqueduct was going to look like. It's from 1913. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see the land loss that this was dependent on, not within the city of Winnipeg, but for the communities, the Anishinaabe communities at Shoal Lake, and in particular, Kikikobeel or Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Oh, sorry, can you skip to the next one? I think I got those out of order a little bit, yes. So the city and the federal government depended on a coercive and especially coercive part of a coercive set of legislation in the Indian Act that allowed them to take reserve lands without any consultation whatsoever. In other words, the very nominal kind of process that was demanded by the federal government to strip, for instance, the community of St. Peter's of its land a few years before, they didn't even have to observe this whatsoever if it was identified as quote unquote necessary for public works. And on the left here, you have the paperwork in Ottawa where the federal government signs off on this. Yes, taking Shoal Lake 40's reserve land is necessary for the public works of building an aqueduct, of fixing the city of Winnipeg's water plant. So with that, Shoal Lake 40 lost a significant part of their reserve land. This was a part of a much wider process. So between 1896 and 1911, significant hunks of prairie reserve land was lost to the processes of surrender. And some of the maps that you saw in Dr. Clausen's presentation, including Roseau River, were reserves that were significantly shrunk in this era. So we see this process why by First Nations who come into Confederation with little land lose it by significant kind of amounts in these years. But with that loss comes the city of Winnipeg's survival, its ability to live without the constant kind of specter of typhoid, which was awful. Like, this is not an insignificant problem. It's not about kind of settler comfort. It's about really profound questions of public health and non-Indigenous survival. But that is secured by a land loss, which is done by fiat, backed by the colonial authority of the federal government, and works to essentially trisect the Shoal Lake 40 Reserve. And you can see that in this image here, because I'm not going to say left and right anymore, because we now know I can do it. But what you can see is how this essentially, the engineering works that are sanctioned by this land loss essentially cut the reserve into three. And what that means is that the people really lost access to those two other parts of the reserve. So in effect, you can quite easily make the argument that they lost 2/3 of their reserve land. They certainly lost an important part of it. And this continues to be something that has been an object of attentions. And I actually first met Jeff Friesen while working on sort of Shoal Lake 40 solidarity work around some of these questions. But I think this is one way we can think of this kind of slow violence of colonialism, working to resource settler communities and families, and working to take it away from Indigenous communities, often in ways that are not visible to settler peoples. Yes, I should just go back one. I lost my order a little bit here. A couple of things about that happens in the 20th century, or the very tail end of the 19th century. After the years that Dr. Clausen talks about, we see a really significant shift in a city, a community that had been Indigenous by all possible meanings of the term, is remade in an image of whiteness. And that is supported by really significant population shifts that reflect the Canadian federal government's active immigration policy, which is to recruit some kind of immigrants and not others. So this includes the active banning of people of Chinese origin after 1923. And this is an important year that's commemorating 100 years since the Chinese Exclusion Act. But before that, since 1885, making Chinese migrants liable to paying a head tax that started out relatively low, ended up being $500, which is the same cost as a down payment for a house in Montreal. So if we want to think about intergenerational wealth and some of the ways that it has passed and has not passed, we also need to think about some of those policies. But what we see is Winnipeg becoming a much different place than it had been before. The lower number there is 1871. That's 1922. This is a period of enormous growth, and the city is remade, and it is remade with Indigenous peoples forced out. And it is remade in ways that reflect that violent exclusion and that then kind of recreate themselves. And it's also remade in certain images and practices of whiteness. If we go to the other image there, this is an old chart here, but what it tells us a little bit about who is living in Winnipeg in 1881 to 1916. These figures are probably wrong in all sorts of ways, but in their wrongness, they are also illustrative. They are reminders of who was in and who was not in this particular colonial project. But I will also say they're also reminders of the continuing Indigenous presence, because despite all of the processes that were going on in this context, this remains an Indigenous place, even in the parts of it and at the moments where it was the most difficult for Indigenous people to live safely and in comfort in places like the city of Winnipeg. Let's go to the next slide. This is also all tied up with processes of urban planning. And urban planning is something that we think about as having a real importance for kind of structuring the worlds that we live in very kind of daily ways that have a huge amount of impact. The areas that were outside of what was then the limits of Winnipeg to the city south, including right around where we are here today, had originally been designated as part of the Half-Breeds Reserve. That land was lost in the ways that Dr. Clausen talked about Throughout these areas, there remained communities of largely Métis working class people in self-made homes, usually referred to as squatters. We now are familiar with the story of Roostertown, not too far away from here, but there was also Dogtown, there was Tin Town, there was Turkey Town, all of them names that were kind of double entendres, and also kind of a window into, I think, Métis humor and generosity. This is a map of Roostertown, which kind of moved a little bit over the course of the 20th century. But at its final years, at the end of the 1950s, was located right where we think of as Grant Park Shopping Mall, and the Pan Am Pool and the high school are today. But Roostertown was steadily diminished over really the course of the middle of the 20th century, until the remaining families in 1960 were given $75 and had their homes torn apart. These were homes which families built over decades. They were often homes to very large families. And I'd encourage you all to visit the new library at Grant Park, which has amongst the displays really lovely genealogies of Roostertown families. And they give you a sense, and if you're a Winnipegger, you'll recognize the family names. But they also give you a sense of the size of those families and the length of time that communities lived in these places. Most of the men worked in the building trades. They also worked in the railroads, and they used their skills as kind of carpenters and builders to build homes that families lived in for long periods of time. Some folks in Roostertown lost their land through a range of different kind of administrative techniques. And those are all documented in the book Roostertown, which you should all read if you haven't read it, by Evelyn Peters and her co-authors. But the final families that had their houses torn down in 1960 and received $75 disproportionately ended up living in North End rooming houses afterwards. And one of the families that were interviewed explained that it took them 40 years, I think, for the family to regain any land holding in the terms of owning their own houses. So I think of these things: immigration policy, domestic water supply, city planning that saw some communities as slums that needed to be torn down in order to build swimming pools and high schools and shopping malls, as some of the sort of the slow violence of settler colonialism that kind of has worked in ways that solidify, that give power to, and really lock down those processes of dispossession of Indigenous peoples, of Indigenous communities, and the reallocation of that wealth and all that goes with it to non-Indigenous people. So the world that I inherited, which was a segregated one, that even if settler people struggled and were working class folks who lived paycheck to paycheck, our lives were occasionally made better by small kind of inheritances from our grandma, by the knowledge that if we had some rough times, that our mom's best friends might be able to help us out, that we could access government services and the services of state and its resources without judgment, and a sense that that was part of our kind of rights and our world as Canadians. All of these are constituent parts of the making of a world wrought by settler colonialism. And as we think about reparations and we think about land back, we also want to think about ways that we can make reparations that might meaningfully reflect the other colonial processes beyond the theft of land that have worked to sort of solidify, to cement, and to buttress that most profound loss, and that most profound loss that so much of settler ease and comfort in the world depends. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shalisa and Adele, for those amazing presentations. And we want to jump right in so that we can have the full half hour of questions. So I'm actually going to invite our three amazing women presenters onto the stage, if you're willing to come up. And I think there's amazing ways in which these tied together. I think of the image, the powerful image of the broken vase. And I think about, you know, the vase isn't going to be that the vase of southern Manitoba here where we're located isn't going to be fixed like that. And there's no way to do it. It's inalterably changed. And yet we, you know, what does that look like? How do we do repair today? So I invite you to ask questions. Melanie has a roving microphone. And if you have questions, and there'll also be some that I know that are online as well that were shared. Maybe, is there one? Not yet? Okay. Well, then Michael has one back there, and maybe we'll invite others as well.
Just really quick, my friends would be disappointed if I didn't just make a quick comment. Rather than lost lands, they would prefer occupied lands, because I believe colonialism is unsustainable, and they're not lost, because lost is permanent, and not was Indigenous lands, but are Indigenous lands. Anyway, thank you.
Questions that any one of you have? Go ahead, Sandy. Okay. We'll go to that after Sandy. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sandy Lowen from Rivers Church. I have been, I just want to thank you for the language of being beneficiaries of the actions of the people who've gone before us, who've benefited by taking away the land and other things, all our relatives that I heard you speak about, Sarah, and the history of all of that. And I will be going, well, Irene and I will be going back to our church and speak about it that way, because I have been kind of questioned by saying, why do you call yourself a settler or a colonizer? You had nothing to do with it. And I've sometimes not responded because I didn't think I could do it in a way that wouldn't make people feel like I was being aggressive. And so now you've given me that language. So I thank you very much for that. And I will remember that forever. Thank you.
There's one question online. I'll try and read it. Is it Highlanders in Scotland forcibly removed crafters from the lowlands, tied them, threw them on boats and shipped them to Canada. I'm curious to know if there are descendants in the audience. I know there's one Scottish. Yeah, there's a Scottish descendant. Scottish, maybe not from that particular one. I don't know. Any other thoughts on that? And there's another question here. Thanks.
Hi, so this is all very fascinating. The history is really fascinating, but I'm not from Manitoba. So I'm just wondering, do you have any advice on how to learn the equivalent histories from the lands that my ancestors settled? In Ontario for me, but in general. You want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, these are histories that are particular to the context of Manitoba, but they're also histories that are absolutely connected to those around the continent. They are not, wildly dissimilar from what occurs, in Washington State. They are connected to global histories of dispossession and colonization, often tied up with migration. That those stories are kind of connected to in all sorts of ways. within the particular context of Manitoba, there's some really useful resources. There's actually some that if you attend Dr. Clausen's breakout session later, we have some on a resource guide that you can take it, but there's also some of the books that are being offered for sale by the friends at the book table here. But a couple of really great resources would be like the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba has a lot of excellent, kind of easily available, kind of online sources, which I would sort of send anybody to as a first port of call. We're also looking forward to the development of the new Métis kind of history museum that is gradually being come on board. The website of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba is another kind of good place to start. I bet Shalisa might have other suggestions. Or I'll just put her on the spot.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the book table is a great place to start. I think the important thing that can be a takeaway from not only like the local history here in Manitoba, but also more broadly, is that like the violence might look different, but as Adele mentioned, the slow violence, like Manitoba has this interesting history of very fast violence leading and then like a century of like very slow violence that is, you know, still violent, but looks different than like lynch mobs, right? But all of Canada is occupied through that same process of slow violence. So it's just a matter of maybe looking into what that looks like in whatever context you're specifically addressing. But it is there everywhere because that is how settler colonialism is maintained.
Right.
I'd also like to respond. So I think I would issue to you an invitation and to everyone here, an opportunity to begin to think and to look and to see structurally or systemically. So we always want to boil it down to my life, my province, my town, my family, what's my history, what's my obligation based on that. And I want to encourage you to blow that up and say there are systems that have been created to serve you, and they're not going to fall apart on their own. They have to be dismantled. Those systems of oppression don't just impact me and Indigenous peoples. In the context of the United States, I don't know if this is true in Canada, the freeway system was created as a process of racial segregation, just like the water system that you're talking about. And if you're a person that is living in a ghettoized environment, you know this because you're living with that. And if you are a beneficiary, you don't have to know it. So we can really dig in and get down into sort of the specificity of our own story. And that's good and important because telling the truth is important. And there's a fine line where telling that truth becomes a cottage industry of entertainment, where I'm entertaining myself and my kin and my relations by knowing all the things I can, and I can show how awesome I am because I can post it and say, look, all I've learned. At some point, we have to dismantle systems of oppression. And those systems, you call that slow violence, I call it structural violence, laws and policies designed to serve you. They're not going to fall apart. You have to dismantle them. You. We, together, all our relations.
Right. And sometimes we can be good at not knowing our history and or knowing the negative parts of our history, and that too isn't necessarily dismantling the structures. Go ahead, Jeremy.
It's on now? Okay, I'm on. I'm Jeremy. There was two points that were brought up that I want to kind of ask a question around. The first one was, Sarah, you talked about, you know, the idea of right relationship, and anything we do needs to be in right relationship with our Indigenous neighbors. The second point was, Celicia, you talked about, I think it was Celicia, or no, maybe it was Adele, I'm not sure. One of you talked about the daily practice of segregation that you experienced as a Mennonite. And just so thinking about that, if we think about that, so I'm a Mennonite as well, and I can relate to that. So if we think about that as part of our Mennonite ethos, historical ethos at least, and maybe current day ethos, and our segregation as Mennonites today, whether that's ethnically or socially, social class, geographically. What would you say for us? This would be a question for Sarah. How do we work at that if we're talking about right relationship? And if we recognize that there is a level of segregation as part of who we are as a people, both good and bad, and our cultural kind of wealth and history that we carry with us. Do you have any thoughts for us on that?
So anything that I say here is symbolic in nature because we're trying to respond, we three, to these very large socio-political questions in 15 or 20 seconds. So I want to issue you an invitation and everyone here to join us in the coalition to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, because we have organizers that will work with you to actually figure out what that means in your context, because that's a complex conversation. And I also want to plug the Mennonite Coalition for Indigenous Solidarity, which is doing that work in this context. So I think that's a deep conversation. And so I'm going to give it the soundbite response, which is to say that there is only one reality and we all share it. It's one reality with a capital R. And that's reality that's consistent with the systems of life. Interdependence, mutuality, mutual dependence. And my mentor, Steve Darden, would say that anything else is hypnosis. We are hypnotized to believe that we're separate. We're not separate. The outcome for one is the outcome for all. When we know this, when we believe it in our bones, when we cross the line in relationship and we realize our Indigenous neighbors, our Indigenous kin, their survival is bound up with our survival. And if those of us who are from settler, who are the descendants of settlers, want to survive, it will be alongside Indigenous kin or not at all. At this stage, when all of our life support systems are in decline. The way to get at that is in every way. And so, I mean, that's not very satisfying, but let's talk about it more. There's some flyers on the table over there for how to get involved with the coalition. We need you. We want you. You don't have to have any special qualifications. I was at a Mennonite women's gathering once, a couple months ago, and various women talked about stuff they were doing at a regional conference. And there was a woman who was talking about the knitting stuff they were doing. It's really awesome knitting stuff. And I went after her and said, you need more skill to do what they're doing than you need to do what we're doing. All you have to do is show up with your heart and your life energy, and we will work it out together. We'll discern these things mutually in mutuality.
One question up here. How does the church repair its contribution to the slow violence of evangelism that continues to systemically perpetuate the mindset that Indigenous culture is less than and in need of salvation, which can only be accomplished through the destruction of beliefs and community?
You might be shocked to know, might be shocked to know that right now, this very day, in this very moment, our coalition is embarking on, we are in the process of doing decolonization training with Mennonite Mission Network. Did you know that? At an institutional level, at a systems level, at every level, we will survive together or not at all. Not at all. This power imbalance is inconsistent with the forces of nature. It's inconsistent with the systems of life. And redemption for us all, salvation for us all, is found in mutuality. And I'm so thankful to the leadership at Mennonite Mission Network that is willing to embark on that journey. And I want to say, it's not a simple thing. We're doing Bible studies with every single department monthly. The last Bible study I did, which was Thursday, 7 people in it, which is to say lots of Bible studies over months of time as we start forming a theology together to figure out what we mean when we say mission. Mission meaning following the vision of the Spirit of life in this moment with our bodies and our lives and our life energy for the fulfillment of the restoration of all creation. Hey, that is promised to us by Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and is fulfilled. And we see it unfolding in the process of creation, this ongoing process of creation.
My name is Ken, and I have a question directed to Sarah. You're kind of on the hot seat, I guess, but I invite the other people to answer as well. Sarah, I thought I heard you mention about the inadequacies of charity. And could you maybe talk a little bit more on how charity would fit in to decolonization, or how it absolutely can't fit in, whatever is the case?
I absolutely believe in sharing. Sharing is what will save us all. Charity is specifically an idea of retaining and reinforcing power imbalance by othering people that we designate as less fortunate. When we engage in charity, the lucky recipient has nothing to say about how that's going to happen, what the process is. All of that is controlled by that colonial force of charity. Sharing is a different kind of a thing. Sharing is a mutual thing. So let me put it in these terms, stark terms. When your child, I don't know if you're a parent, I am. When your child is struggling and needs help, I'm thinking about my child that's still at home and still a minor, my struggling child. I don't say, gee, that seems like a tough break. Let me see if I have anything left over that, because I have to make sure that I got what I need. And then if there's anything left over, my minor child will see. I spend my life, I reorganize my life to make sure my child's needs are met. That's kin. We don't call that charity. That's family. Hey, that's kin. That's what being a parent is. I say to you, my child, I'll lay down my life for you. I will cross the world for you. That's the kin that we have to live out if we want to survive according to the systems of life, those things that are self-evident.
Can I ask a really quick follow-up question to that? But thinking about the question around charity, but more around like when we give of our excess, you alluded to the question around investments and how our investments are connected to systems of death and oppression and extraction. And so how do we, move beyond just the idea of giving of our excess, whether that's in a congregation or whatever, to actually delving into that question? What practically, how do you delve into that question of investments and our connections to those?
On that table over there is a pile of flyers. Explain how to get involved with the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, because that is a complex, difficult question. I want to tell you, we've been working on it in that coalition alone for 10 years. Okay. And we have one working group that is, Jonathan. It's the Economic Justice Working Group. That hasn't always been its name because it's changed over time as we've learned and grown and our understanding has grown, and as our relationship is deepened with Indigenous peoples. That one working group is doing one kind of a thing, which is really trying to chase down when we have 401ks where our money goes and how we access that money in a good way, how we repurpose that power of owning that kind of money to share power with Indigenous voices so they can advocate for themselves directly with corporations rather than doing shareholder responsibility and stuff that's quite indirect and not always effective, to say, hey, we're reaching out to you, corporation, and we want you to negotiate directly with those people. For example, that's one way, but there's lots, there are lots of strategies that we figure out together in community, in our mutuality, as we learn. It's so much bigger than one imagination, certainly much bigger than mine, but we are all of us enmeshed in systems of darkness. And it's going to take all of us to figure out a pathway out. And I want to hear from my sisters too here.
You wanted to hear from your sisters too? Did you want to speak to that before I ask my question? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have much to add, but just want to echo, the need for structural change that existing in right relation requires. And I think we all know from our lives how totalizing these systems are. And there's no easy out to that. And to engage in this requires, really social change of really significant magnitude. And certainly we've seen some of those things, within our own lives, and we can push for more in really important ways. So that's not very much to add, but it's a little tough.
Much easier question. So take a deep breath. To Dr. Clausen or anyone else, I was really excited to see the maps and all this, because a lot of work I've been doing this summer is about unpacking the places my ancestors have settled along the way to Winnipeg. And as part of my anti-colonial abolition work, I'm trying to use the original names, and I'm finding they're all lost. And your work at UBC, is that going on?
Oh, well, I did not create any of the maps, so I can't, and I'm not a map maker. So unfortunately, my answer to that is I don't know those original names. That is not the work that I do, unfortunately. I work mostly with colonial sources where those names have been, erased for obvious reasons. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a really solid answer other than that. I too would like to know those names. If anyone does know those names, please tell me.
Part of the conversation. I know, Diane, you had your hand up, of course, too, Mary, as well. So, Diane, you want to go, and then Mary will make sure we get a chance to.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing in different perspectives, because too often I think we go.
Hold on, we've got a little mic thing here.
Oh, no.
You just have to hold it.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? So it's I think too often we have sectors that do Indigenous work, so-called Indigenous work. So it's really exciting to bring in these different perspectives that remind us we're all responsible to have that anti-colonial analysis and perspective. And I was really moved by your comment, Sarah, about counting the cost, because I just would be interested for you to speak a bit more about what is the cost of not taking these actions rather than the cost of taking the actions. And I can't help but, I mean, most of you have been so involved, but be reminded of Search the Landfill and how that, I've heard very progressive people say, well, yeah, but the money should be spent better, So I'm just curious what you think the cost, especially as people of spiritual grounding, what is the cost of us not taking this action, not walking this road together, not walking the path of right relations, instead of what is the cost and having that as an impairment?
Yeah, so yeah, I like that scripture. I think the last one I read from Revelations, the Alpha and Omega one. And I guess I would just reiterate that there's only one side here. We think there are two sides. There's the rational side and the spiritual side, or there's the good guy side and the bad guy side, but there's only one side, and that is the side of creation and the creator. There's only one. And survival, our ability to survive and thrive is based on our ability to live in a way that's consistent with those systems. And when we don't live in a way that's consistent with those systems, what we get is death. Those are the systems, forces of death. The end. I mean, so I think, when you're saying, rationally, we have to count the cost, I think it's important to remember whose words those are. Those are the words of empire. Those are not the words of Jesus, the liberator. Jesus, who said, don't think that I came to bring peace, but a sword. I will divide father against son and mother-in-law against daughter-in-law. And Mennonites don't love hearing that. But the fact is, those are words of liberation for the oppressed. That peacemaking is not maintaining the emotional climate of a room. Hey, it's standing with the oppressed, imagining a world that does not yet exist, the kingdom of God, That's our call, right? And to not comply with that, the cost is, well, everything, your own soul, eh? I mean, whatever. I'm not like talking damnation or anything like that, but I mean, we have this, I mean, let's just put it in positive terms. We have this amazing opportunity to spend our life energy in cooperation and collaboration with that spirit of life and this unfolding gift of the processes of creation. And, these are dark times. I mean, we think they're dark times. They are dark times. What a gift to be alive now. Our generation right now, those of us breathing and alive, are defining reality now. What will we do? I wonder. Will we give in and just pass away into darkness and live lives of insignificance, and we get to keep our little sticky purple gumdrops? Or will we release those things to the fullness of life?
Oh, I don't have to turn it on. They turn it on. Okay. So on that note, sort of, it occurs to me that for settler people, one of the things that is being dismantled is our image of who we are. And for Canadians, for sure. I imagine for Mennonites, I'm an Anglican, definitely for Anglicans. And it seems to me that grief is part of that. It's letting go of that image of us as good people and finding out we weren't good people. Our ancestors, our beloved grandparents were not good people. And is the coalition doing work on enabling grieving or grief support? I know churches do know how to do that. But I don't know that they're applying it to this issue. So that's.
Yeah, so answer it in a roundabout way. All of us are descended from someone. And we get to show up now as the representatives of those people that came before us. So we can think about our ancestors with compassion. I do. I think about my grandmother, whose little tiny baby was taken out of her arms in 1943. That was my father. He was shipped 300 miles away to grow up in an institution. And a lot of difficult trauma resulted from that. When my homeland was taken away from my people by executive order to build the bomb, my homeland that's completely contaminated by toxic waste. So anyway, that's my story. But my point is, I'm showing up today for her. She's gone. She's long gone. My dad too, but I'm here. How do I show up for my people now? I have the opportunity to do that. And so do you. How do you show up on behalf of your ancestors with compassion and grace, saying that maybe didn't turn out the way they thought it would turn out, but anyway, I'm alive now. How do I work towards restoration now? I have the opportunity to do that now. This is very much a conversation in the coalition, because the coalition is made up of Christians, primarily white Christians, nearly all white Christians, not just Mennonites, who are willing to take this on together. And so you bet we're writing laments and so on, and a variety of other things, but that's not really so important. The product, what is important is the relationship. Many of us say we come out of conviction, we stay out of love, because we grow loving relationships with each other as activists, as co-travelers on the road. And that's what we invite you to, this mutuality of community. And, we now can do that virtually. We don't have any bricks and mortar. We do it all virtually. And just one more plug I will tell you is that we are a coalition of working groups, not organizations. Anybody on earth can form a working group. If you want to form a working group on lament, whoop-de-doo, we'll get people to join you. Anybody with energy is welcome, and we are finding our way together. And so I would also encourage you to reverse this thinking of a consumer thinking. What will you create? Not what can I consume from you, the coalition, but what do I bring to the coalition? So many gifts come to us. So often we're like, okay, we'll try that out. We had a group that created a play. Some of you have seen it. That wasn't from my imagination. Did you know we've had a group 5 years together longer building a board game? That's their solution to decolonization. I love that. It's part of changing the culture. There's an entire group. All they do is pray. They pray for me. They pray for the other activists. They pray for our Indigenous partners. They pray for the movement. That's what they know how to do and want to do. And we invite all people who want to be part of it to come in. We need you. We want you all.
I also just wanted to, I'll just pick this up on these questions about dealing with, history and how we inherit it and push back against it in different ways. And I think one of the things that kind of history gives us is an opportunity to always face up to the very, very difficult parts of the past produced by people who live in complicated times. And I can also say that I'm pretty sure that people of this particular moment aren't going to look particularly shining and outstanding in 50 years' time. But I also think people in the past, we owe them the honor of taking what they did seriously. And I think that that doesn't mean doing so without compassion, but it means giving them, the honor of serious consideration, recognition of the structures that they all lived within, that limited the possibilities of what they did and didn't do, but also of taking them seriously and creating a kind of vision of the past and kind of a way of thinking about the past that doesn't throw them out just as simply a long line of terrible people, because that's way too easy. But gives us the tools to work through the present by also taking their history and their own actions as people seriously. And that's a kind of honor as well.
I think just to kind of build upon what has already been said, as someone who works a lot with the complicated histories of her own people, there is a grieving process, but I think then there's also a really optimistic process of understanding that once you know the history that maybe has been hidden, you don't have to continue in it. There's a shift that you can make going forward where you can actively confront those parts of your culture, of your society, of the structural systems that we live within, and you can do better. And we're all limited by our own circumstances, but once you can recognize the systems, recognize your own history, you don't have to repeat it. So I think that's a big part needed to think optimistically too. There's a grieving process, but there's also this hope of not being stuck there. You can feel bad for your ancestors or what are the stories that were wrong, but you can also write a new story, right? And do your part to create that new story.
Thank you, all three of you, for leaving us in a place of optimism and for during this time. Let's give them a hand for. If we can have a seat here.
All of my random stuff.
Yeah, and I'm sure they'll be happy to have more conversation during lunch hour and other times as well.
So I want to kind of wrap up or kind of consider our next hour and how that's going to look and where you need to be at 1 o'clock. So it was tricky to get you all back here in time. So I'm going to at least give you a 10-minute warning next time so that you know where you go. But I'm going to give you instructions about breakout rooms. So you all signed up for the 3 options. So in the sanctuary will be Dr. Clausen. Will continue the conversation around Mennonite immigration and settler colonialism in the late 19th century.
This is at 1 o'clock.
This is at 1 o'clock in the sanctuary. If you signed up for the Stories of Repair in Manitoba, so the local things with Share the Gifts, Honor the Treaties, you'll be in the dining room at 1 o'clock. So you actually don't have to move from your lunch. But don't distract other people that need to move to a different place. And then the other, talking more about the coalition to end the doctrine of discovery, that will be led by Jonathan, and that there is a room adjacent to the kitchen behind that you will be. So it'll be the smaller opportunity, and you'll be there for both of those sessions. So hopefully you have those in your mind. We're going to put signs on the door so that will direct you. For the 2:15 session, so getting this in your mind. The stories of repair locally will be here in the sanctuary. We know already where Jonathan will be, and Dr. Clausen will be in the dining room. Hopefully that's good. But you know, all the pages will be out here. If you forget anything, you can remember because it's marked on the top. Dieter, they are going to hang out in the sanctuary. Yeah, they don't get a choice, but they'll have two options. So yes, there we go. So we're all hungry. Shelley's Bistro, Indigenous Bistro, has brought in food for us. So super excited. There is a regular meal with Bannock pizza. So you get 2 pieces.